Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Thursday Morning MV Pro Call. Today is February 1st. Wow. And I'd like to welcome those of you that are here live, as well as those of you listening to this via recording, which, of course, you can do by subscribing to Moti-Vitality on whatever podcast application you happen to use, or by visiting Moti-Vitality.com, where you can listen to years and years and years worth of archives. On that note, by the way, on the podcast thing, so apparently Google Podcast is going away, and they're making it all part of YouTube podcasts. And I transferred over all my stuff from the Google Podcast over to YouTube. It was pretty easy to transfer the subscriptions. But then I went to a couple of the other podcast applications, and I started, looking for Moti-Vitality. You have to put the hyphen in if you're doing that. But I am going to, if you can't find it, I'm going to put a link on the podcast page that will allow you to go directly to the recordings. Of course, you can always go to Moti-Vitality.com and listen to them anytime you want, any of the archived ones there. Anyway, there are changes happening in the podcast world, apparently, and I'm trying to keep up with them. So for those of you, it sounds like we've got a lot of people coming on here, that probably people that have never joined us on the MV Pro Call. I welcome you to please not make this the only one you ever visit. We have this call every week, and it's basically just a conversation with people from the industry. We don't talk product and we don't talk company unless we have a special guest. But we all just talk about the stuff that we all run into. We're going to do things a little differently today, just because we do have a guest speaker, and I want to get right to that. So Marianne Metzger has been a guest on our call before, and she always brings just a wealth of knowledge. She's my go-to person when I have questions about laboratories or testing or contaminants that I need to know, how to test for them or what the field test is or those types of things. Marianne worked for a long time at National Testing Laboratories. She now works for Resentech. Managing their lab as well as doing like a billion other things for them. She's got a degree in environmental science and political science, but mostly she's just one of the smartest and nicest people that I know in the industry. So if you don't have a chance to talk to Marianne, if you've never had a chance to talk or meet Marianne, please meet her at the shows or see her at the shows or reach out to her. She's just a wealth of knowledge. And we are honored to have you, Marianne, on our call today, talking specifically about coliform. And you and I were talking right before this call. It's I said, you excited to talk about what I like to refer to scientifically as the poop bacteria, because I like the opportunity to say poop in a professional setting. I don't expect Marianne to necessarily say that, but she's not me. But I thought what you said, Marianne, was kind of funny, and I'm gonna have you start off with that because it's funny but also interesting. So we're talking about coliform bacteria today. Why did you tell me it was going to be fun to talk about this? I thought that was kind of interesting.
Well, I thought it was going to be nice not to talk about PFAS for a moment. We kind of talked about this is one of the retro contaminants. And I think it's kind of important, like we discussed. It's like, yeah, we've got all these new contaminants that are coming out, the emerging contaminants, but, they're still the old school contaminants and they're still showing up. So it's not something that's ever going to go away.
Yeah, I think it's important to understand exactly what you're saying. I mean, yes, PFAS is the hot topic right now and all these emerging contaminants, but these other things are still there, and they're things that we have to worry about. So we had one of our listeners, and by the way, I'm going to ask everybody to mute yourselves, please, unless you have a question later on, just so we don't get the background noise. So please, if you're on the road, that way it's not distracting to everybody. But we had one of our regular listeners and participants on this call ask about testing for coliform. So maybe we could start off right with that, and you could explain what coliform is, what it isn't, what kind of problems do we run into. I mean, just teach us about coliform.
Okay. So when people are looking like they want to have their well tested for bacteria, the typical go-to is going to be coliform, because it's really impractical to test for all the dangerous bacteria that could be potentially in your well water. So when they were coming up with the regulations under the Safe Drinking Water Act, they kind of settled on this method for coliform bacteria. And then we also look for E. coli or fecal bacteria, or as you like to say, poop bacteria.
Oh, you did. I'm so proud of you.
So anyways, the reason that we look for this is it's an economical way to kind of screen for bacteria. It follows the same sort of life cycle that like the dangerous bacteria follow. Like fecal bacteria are actually found in the intestines of mammals, so that's where it comes from. It's a less expensive test to run, and you get kind of an indication of what the water quality is, if there's potentially sewage, if there's potentially these more dangerous bacteria that are in the water. So they're used as indicator bacteria. They indicate a possible presence of other infectious disease organisms that might be in the water. So typically when I see people who are testing for coliform bacteria and it comes back positive, that's not a reason to freak out. Everybody's getting sick, whatever. Coliform bacteria typically are not going to make you sick. It's usually the E. coli's and the fecal bacteria that are going to be more dangerous to you and actually cause illness. Also, by the way, people can build up a tolerance to that as well. So I've had many instances where we've come back and we found E. coli in the water, and people say, I've been drinking this for 20 years and I've never been sick. You may be drinking it for 20 years and never be sick because you've built up that tolerance to that bacteria. But let's say, somebody comes and visits you and drinks that water, they might not have the same reaction. So it's kind of an important distinction as well, because I've had that come up many times in the past.
Marianne, do you mind if, just really quick, can you explain the difference between E. coli and the other bacteria?
Like E. coli is more the bacteria that lives in the gut. So that's more of a poop bacteria than the coliform bacteria is, because coliform bacteria is literally everywhere. It's on our hands. It's in the soil. It lives on all kinds of surfaces, whereas E. coli and specifically other fecal bacteria, E. coli is a subset of fecal bacteria. That's the one that actually lives in the intestines. It goes through the whole system. So that's a true fecal bacteria that can cause illness. Does that answer your question, Jen? I hope.
Yes, yes, it does. Sorry, I muted myself.
The other thing I should mention is because I mentioned like the coliform bacteria is so present in our environment that you can accidentally contaminate your own sample. By touching the inside of the cap, by touching the top of the bottle when you're collecting it, if you don't properly sterilize the bottle, if you don't wash your hands. There's all kinds of ways you could potentially contaminate your own sample when you're collecting a coliform bacteria test. So it's really important to read through those instructions and make sure that you follow them to a T. There are instances in the testing methods out there that you could get a false positive. So there sometimes are some particular bacteria, non-coliform bacteria, that will pop positive. So I've had many of instances where, there's, we've tested at the source, and then we've tested after treatment, and the source tests negative, and then the treated water tests positive, and we know that can't be. So what we found out is there was an introduction of this non-coliform bacteria that we had to speciate out to determine, in fact, there is no coliform in the sample. It's just a non-coliform bacteria that interferes with the test that the lab was actually running. So occasionally you will run into that as well. I don't know if we want to talk about
on that note. It's sort of important, I guess, to recognize that not all bacteria are bad. In fact, pretty much every water sample is going to have some level of bacteria in it, right?
Correct. Yeah. And sort of the other bacteria here that we probably don't test for on a more regular basis is heterotrophic bacteria. And a lot of times, like, labs use that, and other industries use that as sort of like how much bacteria is actually in the water. And that's traditionally where you'll get a count of bacteria. I'm going to say, like, a lot of times when you're running a coliform E. coli test, there's a couple of different ways that you can run it in the laboratory depending on the results that you want to get. So you could get a presence-absence test, or typically the other option is to get an estimated colony count, or the most probable number. So they'll give you an estimate of how many bacteria could be in the water. And then heterotrophic plate count takes a look at all the bacteria, so coliforms and non-coliforms, and kind of gives you an idea of what the bacterial load is in your water. That's important when you're doing disinfection, so that you know how much disinfectant to use.
So it's, when you were looking at now a lot of times, because private wells, right? And I mean, just about every state that I've ever worked with, every client I've ever worked in every state, a new home or to close on a new home requires coliform and nitrates.
Yep.
Some have other stuff, arsenic or different things that might be in the water, but it's almost always coliform and nitrates. And you, so that's private wells will typically have that. Is it necessary for somebody to, once they do that new home, or buy a house and they get a negative test, which in my experience comes back about half the time positive, and it's usually because the person who took the sample didn't do the things that you talked about doing, washing your hands, or washing not your hands. They would need to wash their hands if they're pulling the sample, I guess. And or even just disinfecting the lip of the bottle or the faucet. I took one. I made that mistake, and I think I talked to you about it. We had a positive result that we had sent to you, that we were working with a client a couple of years ago, and we sent a sample that came back, and you asked me, did you disinfect the kitchen faucet? No. And I should know better, but it came back positive, and we went back out. We took the sample as close to the water entering the building as we could, disinfected the spigots and the bottles, and washed our hands and sent it back in. Came back negative. And so that's probably the most common. Would you agree that the positive result is almost always, not almost always, I don't know, what percentage would you say?
I guess it really depends on who's collecting the sample. If it's a water treatment guy who collects bacteria samples all week long, that guy's not going to make that mistake. But like if we're talking homeowners collecting their own samples, I would say it's pretty high, because they don't like to read instructions, apparently. So I would say probably 50-50 in terms of positives, false positives for sampling error.
So what would you say is the best? Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Jim.
No, hi, this is Ken Stice. I had a question.
Hi, Ken.
Hi.
So it's the Ken and Jen show. So what is the best practice for disinfecting the source? I know I've seen where some people will have rubbing alcohol wipes and some people use a blowtorch. So what would you say would be best practice for disinfecting?
Okay, so there's a couple of things. There's also, like, depending on if you're collecting it for, like, a public water supply, maybe a transient, non-transient system, you have to follow the state requirements. And some states will tell you can't use isopropyl alcohol. You have to use a chlorine solution. So it all depends on that. Also, like, one thing to keep in mind is when you're disinfecting spigots, make sure if you're going to use a blowtorch, make sure it's metal and it's not a plastic or other composite type material.
Right.
You might want to make sure that there's no concerns about methane being in the water. You don't want to blow anything up. My sort of preference.
I didn't think of that one.
Believe me, I've had these conversations before, so you live and you learn. But, my preference is to use isopropyl alcohol, especially like for homeowners. It's readily available. It's, easy to use. It's not, dangerous to use. So that's typically where I would end up. But obviously if you're collecting outside from a hose bib that's metal, you can use a blowtorch. it really depends on your preference and also like the regulations, what they say.
Ken, you had a question? Ken? I think we may have lost Ken.
Stacy here, though.
Oh, Stacy, go ahead. Ken, did I hear you? Hang on, Stacy. Ken, did I hear you? Okay, I'm sorry. I thought I heard he had jumped in there a couple times. Okay, go ahead, Stacy.
That's okay. I was going to say I never really thought about a blowtorch, but if I'm doing an outside spigot, I'll normally do alcohol wipes, run the water some more, and then use a candle lighter, the long candle lighter things, to really burn off the alcohol off that and really give it a good, hopefully, disinfection, and then run the water some more.
I like to run the water in between as well. And I think using both, as far as I'm concerned, more is better when it comes to this. You can't disinfect it too much. The only other thing I should caution people against is like when they are using like chlorine, especially, make sure like you're not collecting volatile organic chemicals directly after your bacteria, because you could potentially contaminate that sample if you use a chlorine solution. So just things to kind of look out for. But yeah, I don't think it's a problem using a combination of both the isopropyl alcohol and flame.
That's on the spigot, not on your fingers, right? So alcohol and blowtorch on the fingers probably not a good idea.
Yeah.
I mean, isopropyl is not bad on the fingers.
So lighter, we're not flaming way out.
Marianne, the EPA requirements, primary drinking water requirements, say that you can have no more than 5% of samples, and that's always struck me as, I mean, we know that coliform itself is an indicator bacteria, but but that sample is not zero. I mean, I would expect the goal would be zero, but that means that if you have 100 glasses of water and five of them potentially could have coliform in there, that's how do we address that or talk about that, or is there more to that regulation than just a 5% maximum rule?
Well, I kind of think that the 5% is based on the fact that there are sampling errors and there are false positives with some of the testing methods out there. So they give them a little bit more leeway. Also, when you're talking about coliform, coliform in general is not like the disease-causing organism. So it's an indicator. So anytime they get a coliform, they do have to notify public. They do have to take some sort of action, to rectify that. They have to immediately collect extra samples to confirm that. So I think the 5% really is more like the leeway based on, the fact that, yes, we do get sampling errors, and yes, there are false positives with the method itself.
Yeah. What about field testing? I mean, I get that, because Moti-Vitality carries test kits. We get that question all the time. Is there a test? And we do sell some. You and I were talking about this the other day, and there's I actually have a couple here that I plan on doing a nice little experiment that I talked to you about. I'm going to basically I've got two of them, and I'm going to spit in one and, I don't know, put RO water in another and test the other and just see if they culture. I mean, that would probably do it, right? Spitting in it or whatever would probably put coliform in there. So, and I'm just curious what it's going to look like. But I was reading the instructions, and these definitely do not, they're not an immediate result. You're not going out to the house and pouring water in there and go, yep, you have bacteria. I mean, it takes days in order to see the results on that. Do you have any experience with field tests? Do you have any suggestions for types of field tests? Not necessarily brand names, but the type, what works better, or suggestions on whether they're a good idea or not a good idea to use?
So there's a lot of different kinds of field test kits out there. I've tested a couple. Some are good, some are not so good. And I would say like the ones that you kind of want to look for are the color change ones. And what you kind of want to look for one that's going to change color to like something totally different. Like a lot of times the ones that we use in the laboratory, like I guess I'll mention IDEX is a pretty popular coliform test that I'm going to say 90% of labs use. It changes to a yellow color. So when we're talking about yellow color, like you've got tannins in water, you've got iron in water, that can mask that color change, or you might indicate something's positive when it's not. So I would say, microbiologists and people in the labs that run that are more sensitive to that potential interference versus out in the field. So there are field kits where it'll turn a brighter, like a bright blue or a purple color. That's what I would look for, something that's going to be a definitive color change. And I know there's a couple of kits out there. There's a company called Ready Cult, which is a competitor to IDEX. Theirs turns a purple color, I believe. So that's a good one for the field, especially somebody who's not an experienced microbiologist can look and see, okay, there's a clear color change.
And how would you say, generally when we're testing for stuff like that, I usually recommend, and I'm curious about your thoughts on this, if you have a positive result on something like that, I usually recommend then going to verify those results. If I'm a water treatment guy and I test something positive for bacteria, I'm not a certified lab, so right. I would then say, I would usually recommend, okay, I tested positive. I think I would definitely take this and test again at a lab to verify. What's your thoughts on field testing in general, on whether we should be doing it, on the pros and cons of it? How do we talk about it with the customer?
Well, field bacteria, and it all depends. Bacteria has a short holding time. So you have 30 hours from the time you collect it to the time the lab has to start analyzing it. So if you're located next to a lab and you use them, that's great because you're getting the sample to them quickly. But if you have to ship it out, you have to time everything correctly. So using a field kit, is a good indicator. Plus there's the expensive shipping and all that. So I think field test kits are a great thing. If it comes back negative, there's not a lot of false negatives in those tests. So I would say you're good. But if you do get a positive result, yes, it is a health-based contaminant, and you should have a certified laboratory confirm that result. Additionally, if we're talking about a private well, I would take additional action immediately in case there is actually bacteria there. Chlorinating the well or recommending a UV or whatever it happens to be, but make sure that you explain that to the customer. There's a potential that this organism could be present. It may not cause illness, but here's the thing with bacteria. It could be there one day and be gone the next day. You just don't know when it's going to show up. So you mentioned 2 treatment methods. Is there a better way if you have persistent, because in my experience, that's usually the way you do. If you're on a private well, you test positive for coliform, you reshock the well and it goes away. And the thing is, most people don't, I know the EPA recommends you test for coliform once a year, I believe. Most homeowners don't ever do that, I don't think. And I never did. When I was in my house for 16 years on a private well, and I tested for it the first time and never did after that, and I'm in the industry. Yeah. Is there a recommended treatment that, will our coliform very easily, deactivated or taken care of with UV? Or, what would be the suggested treatment method for handling persistent bacterial issues? I would say UV is optimal. It's something that you're not adding chlorine to the water consistently, so you're not creating, byproducts using that. It's just kind of like that added safeguard, especially when you're thinking I shocked my well this year, and let's just say I actually go back and test it next year and it's positive again. Keeping that UV in there is going to help protect you should that bacteria show up unexpectedly and you're not testing for it, because nobody wants to test their water consistently. And I will say, just being in the industry for this long, in the beginning, people would do the same thing you just mentioned. I tested my well when I moved in, and, it's been 20 years and I'm good. But I'm going to say, I'm seeing more of a pattern of people testing their water annually. and it's not just for bacteria. More and more people are becoming concerned about the water quality, so they are following those types of recommendations.
Yeah. Scott, I wanted to make sure this was the topic that you had suggested, which, by the way, I love when you guys suggest topics for these calls, so please send them to me. Let me know. It makes it way easier for me not to have to come up with topics on my own. So I love that. But, Scott, did you have any questions about this specifically that Marianne could answer or that we could talk about?
Well, I just want to make sure that we're using the right word track when we go out and see somebody with a well. Because, I mean, as of right now, we do not have the ability to test for coliform or E. coli in the field. And so when we
can help with that, by the way, Scott.
Well, we can talk. But when we go out and have the conversation, typically if they're calling us out, it stinks, it stains, there's something aesthetic with it. And so when we have those conversations, this is what will take care of the problem that you brought me out here for. However, we don't have the ability to test for coliform or E. coli, which is a bacteria. The city puts chlorine in the water to disinfect it. You don't have that with well water because it is raw water coming out of the ground. I highly recommend adding a UV light as an extra layer of protection. So even if there's bacteria in there, or if there's not, or if it shows up later, it's an insurance policy. It's an extra layer of protection for you and your family. Is that the correct way to talk to them about that?
I'd like that. I like the insurance policy because, it could be, like I said, it could be there today and not there tomorrow, and in 2 more weeks it shows up. So I think the UV as an insurance policy is a great way to talk about it.
And I like the way that you said, so if somebody has lived there for 20 years, I've been drinking this for 20 years and it's never made me sick. Well, you've built up a tolerance. But if somebody comes and visits who is not used to the water and drinks it, it could make them sick.
Yep.
Okay.
I mean, it's the same sort of thing like when we go to Mexico and drink the water down there. They built up a tolerance to the bacteria, the natural bacteria that's in their water. It's going to make us sick. So it's sort of the same thing, just the different strains of bacteria that are present. And yeah, you definitely do build up a tolerance to it.
This is exactly what I needed. Thank you so much.
Okay, we got about 2 minutes. Any other questions for Marianne on this topic?
This is Patty in Florida. Just one quick question. You mentioned the 30-hour span from time of collection to time of testing. What's magic about the 30 hours? Is that everything dying because of lack of oxygen or lack of food, or what's going on with that 30-hour period?
So usually it's the food source. So like, and the coliform bacteria are very resilient. So like, don't be fooled. Like you could get a test that shows up at the lab 5 days later and they test it for coliform bacteria and it's there. It's just a matter of like how much food is in that water. Let's just say how much bacteria, where they are in the growth cycle. So if the bacteria are multiplying and multiplying, then the food source gets scarce, then they start to die off. So that can affect, one, whether they're present or not, or two, if you're actually doing a count, the estimated colony counts could be off if you get past that 30 hours. To me, presence absence is usually the most key thing, whether they're just present or not. But sometimes you do need to know like how much bacteria is there depending on how you're treating it. But yeah, it's usually the food source and where they are in the life cycle. That's where that 30 hours comes in.
Thank you.
Excellent. So I did have Elaine or Ken. I just got a text message. I know you guys are trying to. Are you able to hop on and ask your question real quick? I saw that you guys had a question here.
Well, yeah, but Ken says it's going to be too long, so he'd better just have the contact so we can just ask it directly because he thinks it's going to be a long question.
Okay. Well, shoot, I wish we could have. Well, I mean, Marianne, do you have another 5 minutes? Because we are recording.
I actually have another meeting like that's going to start like now.
Okay, so yeah. So do you have contact information then, Marianne, that we can, where if they have further questions, they could hop in there and send you a question?
Yeah, absolutely. If they want to reach out to me, my email address is M as in Marianne, and then my last name, Metzger, so another M-E-T, Z as in zebra, G as in girl, E-R, and that's at Resintech, RESINTECH.com.
And I will put that in the description of this call as well when I get it uploaded. So, Elaine, thank you so much. Or I'm sorry, Mary. Elaine, thank you too. They're up at 6:30 in the morning to listen to this, or 5:30 in the morning, I guess. 5:30 in the morning to listen to this. So thank you. But Marianne, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. As I said, you're always a wealth of knowledge, and I really appreciate your feedback and the information that you've given us. Everybody else, thank you so much. Be safe. We will talk to you next week, if not before. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.